All right. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I hope everybody is enjoying our wonderful DC weather today, or maybe since we're in these crazy times, you're in someplace nicer. But I'm stuck at home anyway. So we're really excited to have an outstanding panel join us today. A couple of notes is that we are on regular Zoom, so please keep your mics muted. We will have an opportunity for questions and answers towards the end, or you can always throw your questions in chat and I'll make sure that we cover it and that sort of thing or whatever. So I do want to thank all of our speakers for joining, and also NVTC and Harmonia for co-sponsoring this. I am going to open the mic up really quickly to Tom just to say a few words about NVTC as a co-sponsor. Tom?
Sure. Thanks so much, Ken. So NVTC, the Northern Virginia Technology Council, the largest association of tech companies in the country, is based in Northern Virginia. Our world is about promoting digital transformation technology, solving real problems through education, idea exchange, and especially networking. So if you're interested in what we're doing, we've got a stack of committees and events just like this. Please reach out, nvtc.org. Thanks, Ken.
No problem. And then thanks again to Harmonia for co-sponsoring. I am going to go through a couple of things, and then I did want to turn it over to Assad. So first of all, please join AACC if you have an opportunity. Members do receive the slides and recordings first, so support us and help us kind of continue to grow these webinar series to share and help economic development across the region. Full disclosure, it's for informational purposes only. None of this content is legal or legal advice. Obviously this is AACC material, so please let us know if you're going to share it outside. Not that, we obviously want to share this with all the public that we can, but make sure that you let the AACC know. So without further ado, I do want to thank Assad, who is the CTO of Harmonia, for having them sponsor this event. Assad, if you could go ahead and do an intro about Harmonia and also an intro of the speakers.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ken. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Assad Moini. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Harmonia. We are a federal contractor supporting both DoD and federal agencies. Company started back in 2006 as an offshoot of Virginia Tech, primarily working on R&D type work. Since then, we have expanded our portfolio of work, continue doing R&D work, but also supporting multiple federal agencies on larger scale programs and activities, focusing on cloud enablement, analytics, operations and maintenance, as well as custom software development using a variety of methods and technologies. So with that, I appreciate the opportunity for being here, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists today. We have three thought leaders who have spearheaded digital transformation efforts in their respective agencies. Our first speaker panelist is Dr. Matan Patel Nagaraja. I beg your pardon. She is the Deputy Director of Division of Science, Engagement and Partnership for the Science Mission Directorate at NASA's headquarters. In her role, Dr. Nagaraja leads the overall strategy for external information technology, executive communication and strategic messaging, science mission graphics visualization, digital media, and science in Spanish. Prior to this position, she was the lead mechanical engineer for instrument technology design for a proposed planetary mission to Venus and science operation engineer for landing mission to the moon at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. She has trained astronauts who flew aboard the Space Shuttle and the International Space Station. Among her most notable recognition are when in 2013 and 17, she was selected for a rare interview opportunity to become an astronaut. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Aerospace Engineering from Texas A&M, a master's degree in mechanical engineering and a PhD in bioengineering, both from Georgia Tech. Our next panelist is Nishu Kassim. She is the Executive Director of U.S. Digital Service at Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services at HHS. In her role, she leads digital modernization efforts at CMS. Most recently, she spearheaded the effort for modernizing the Medicare claims payment system. Earlier in her career, she supported several federal agencies, including NASA, IRS, working on flight software as a security engineer and supporting system architecture projects. Through her work as a contractor with the small businesses and startup, she brings a wealth of experience in government procurement and effective team building. She received her bachelor's and master's degrees in electrical engineering from Johns Hopkins University. Our final panelist and speaker is Dr. Zach Whitman. Dr. Whitman joined the US Census Bureau as the Chief Data Officer in 2016 to promote the use of census data in the public and commercial sectors. He is currently leading the efforts developing the Census Bureau's enterprise data dissemination strategy and the platform. You can browse the platform as data at data.census.gov. His prior experience included developing data dissemination platforms, leading civic data engagement events, and creating public-private partnership at multiple departments, including housing and urban development, homeland security, and transportation departments. His career mission is to promote the utility and interoperability of governmental open data through improved data discovery and accessibility. So with that, I'd like to welcome our panelists, and back to you, Kim. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Assad. So very exciting stuff. So let's get right into kind of the panel conversation. You know, we have a pretty close-knit community here in the DC area, and I'm sure they would love to hear your origin stories. So we'll start off with a little bit of a personal thing. You know, when you were a kid, what did you want to grow up to be? And how did that ultimately lead you to where you are today? So Zach, I'm gonna pick on you first.
Yeah, I didn't prepare for this one. This is good. You know, I've always liked to see how relate to one another. And, you know, I started out in the natural sciences primarily, and I was looking into geology and then its human interaction. So, you know, that naturally moved into geography, and social geography really took hold. And that really guided me through the idea that, you know, a lot of the things that we go through are very predictable and also preventable if we just think about them. You know, one of my things that I thought about when I was working on, you know, my research was, you know, why don't we invest in upfront activities that have huge cost avoidance measures should any kind of impact happen. So natural disasters are a really good example where, you know, it's really easy to respond to a disaster because there's this thing that you need to combat and resolve. But if you look at investing earlier, you can really see a lot more sustainable approaches kind of show themselves, and it helps us think about, you know, where we invest in our efforts. You know, firefighting is important. We need to have that type of mentality, but if we shirk the upfront thoughts and we kind of leave that to a response only phase, then things get a little challenging. So, you know, when I was, you know, coming into the government, I was working as a contractor, you know, working with a lot of different agencies, and we saw a lot of these kind of late responses that were more a direct result of just not having the investment and the leadership up front to say, like, we want to work on these problems and get ahead of them rather than letting them grow into something bigger. And I really enjoyed the idea that data ultimately is a good conduit for a lot of this. Without that information, without a way to gather intelligence and make predictions more accurately for scenario-based modeling and things like that, you tend to be kind of in this very reactive state. I was approached by Census because there was a very strong sense of leadership in terms of we want to take a new position on how we make our data more usable. We understand that there are a lot of challenges in terms of having folks understand our data and then use it, not just the public, but also our public partners. So FEMA, for example, is a very active user of our data for disaster response modeling and in general DRR type activities. And so we are working hand in glove with our partners, both public and private, to ensure that people have access to this tapestry of data and allow them to find more value out of it rather than it being somewhat limited in its reach. So really bringing that tangibility to users and the public more broadly.
Great, thanks. Misu, you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you all for joining us today and giving up your lunch hour to hang out with us. Really appreciate it. Like Ken mentioned, I'm Mishu Tasnim. My background is in electrical engineering. I have found myself in the health IT space kind of quite by accident. I wanted to grow up and be an astronaut. Unfortunately, when I did graduate is when they stopped. I was too young to enter the program. I was too old to kind of like slide it, or yeah, too old when they restarted it. So, but fortunately though, I was still able to get my first job at NASA working as a flight software engineer, which was incredible. But I think I slowly realized that like I enjoyed more working on problems where you didn't really know the answers to it. And so kind of started to tinker around at other agencies and figuring out where that spot was, and kind of have found that spot in healthcare. There are so many issues that we know about and hear about in healthcare, but you can't just Google an answer for it, and which is kind of the space that I like to be in, is, you know, a place where you use the things that you know and understand and are well proven, but to solve problems that like you don't quite know what the solution is, and like you never really know it's going to work until you try it.
Nice. Always wanted to be an astronaut. Mamta, how about you? I think there's a common thread there.
Yeah, I don't think anybody on this call will be surprised to hear that I too grew up wanting to explore space, to be an astronaut. I would lie down in the grass. I grew up in a small town in West Texas, and you could see the stars, and I would just look up and wonder what was out there. It definitely drove me to my current career, which you heard Assad just summarize. But I would say, like most young people, and I'm a mom now, and I see it in my children too, I grew up really just wanting to help people. And a lot of us dream just to leave the world better than it is, that we dream to change the world, to make people's lives easier and better. And someone somewhere along the way connected science and engineering to being able to help people for me. And I'm grateful that that happened, because where I grew up, nobody really talked about engineering. Nobody really, I mean, it was just a small town with very limited resources, especially back then. There's no internet. So I'm glad that somebody connected that I could help people in the field that I'm in, because I definitely enjoy it. If anyone has been paying attention to the news, we land on Mars later today after this panel, 3:55 Eastern time. So I think when things like that happen, it reminds me how exciting it is, especially, you know, in anyone's career. You go through those lulls where you might get bored or you desire change, and then we do something incredible like what we're about to do today, and hopefully as successfully as we have in the past. But yeah, I'd say I dream to do what I'm doing. I do have other dreams now that I'm older. Like I dream to play the piano, which has been my big COVID thing. I've been learning to play the piano, but I'd say I'm doing pretty much what I dreamt I would be doing.
We're going to have you play at the end of the thing.
Oh, please don't. Yeah, for your sake, please don't. Twinkle, twinkle, little star.
Yeah, it is exciting. The Mars 7 minutes of terror, is it? Or something like that going on later.
Yeah, the last 7 minutes, no comms, and you just hope that everything you've done as a team works. And then you prepare for the working and the not working. Yeah, both, just amazing. In case.
It is amazing. So let's talk a little bit about our opportunities. I'm going to work through like basically the description of the event. So first we'll start with opportunities. What do you see as the most interesting or impactful digital transformation initiative in the near future at your agency? So we'll start with Misu this time.
Sure, happy to take this one first. One of the things that we're starting to see now is over the last like 5 to 10 years, let's say, like big data and publishing data has been a big thing at most of our agencies across the government. What we're starting to see now is the shift in mindset towards data as a product, right? Like I think, Zach, you were alluding to this. We have tons of data out there publicly available. What we haven't coalesced around is the framework for trying to find that data. So essentially what we have done is created a bunch of libraries and told everyone like, well, good luck. None of our shelves are labeled. None of the books have stickers on the spines, you know, like have fun. And then you have people now coming up into data science, which is a more prevalent major than it was 15 years ago. People coming in and being like, I can't find anything. This is a hot mess. And then leaving the field, which is what we want to prevent. And I think in order to prevent that, that is an area of transformation that I'm starting to see, and I think we should start to like focus on is how do you make data the product instead of a web app or a application, a mobile application be the product, the way that we think of product. How does data back it up, and how do you get users, not just developers, to understand what the data means, but also your average consumer?
Nice. How about you, Mamta?
Yeah, I would say actually one of the big things at NASA, Misu, is the same, the big data. What do you do with these petabytes and petabytes of data? And we too have created individual libraries, and we stick it all in there because that's the requirement for missions. But how do we more strategically connect all of those and make it easier for somebody in even just the general public, like a citizen scientist who might be interested in delving into that data? Sure, the mission teams and the scientists, the career scientists know how to access it because they've been doing it for so long, and they train the newbies who come up in the field. But how do you make it more accessible to a wider group of people? And I think that will definitely be an upcoming opportunity that we'll see in the near future. I also think search engine optimization has finally caught on with leadership. I mean, we in this space know how important it is, but we are going through a major transformation of web at NASA, just taking all of the websites, and Ken would know this for sure, but I mean, NASA has sprawled in the digital space, and some of those are not actual sites meant for people, like humans, to come and read. They're meant for back-end application enabling. But a lot of them are sites that people put up because 25 years ago, there was nothing that said you couldn't. If you wanted a website, you could just build a website. So instead of strategically doing it all under one main agency site, we have a sprawl. So we're going through and trying to transform and undo a lot of what's happened in the past. And I think there might be opportunities that come from that. And what those of us who are in the IT space have really been pushing up to leadership is the importance on search engine optimization, knowing that at least half of the people who come to websites at NASA are getting there by searching for the content. And the other half aren't just coming to your homepage and browsing. That's like long in the past, right? We know this in this room, in this virtual room, but just making sure that leadership understands where we need to invest. One of those areas is definitely search engine optimization. So I think that's possibly an opportunity in the near future.
And Zach, how about you?
Yeah, just supporting everything that was just said. I think the funny thing about these data repositories, because we do have this mandate, especially with the legislation that has come out, that we need to be releasing as much public data as possible. But there is an issue with discovery. As the more data you add to these systems, the harder things become to find. You end up clouding the discovery piece and making it harder on the user, and the onus is really on the user to sift through all of these different data to understand what is the right answer. And I think the census, we're very acutely aware of this because we tend to have a relatively base level of results that people use to augment on top of. It's a typical thing that you'll see, or it's a good starting place is, some sort of like pop or demo question, or maybe some econ data you can add into and then supplement with your own research. And how can we enable folks to not only access that data and sense its tangible value, not only to maybe their professional career, but also to their personal life. But then how do we make sure that the data that they are accessing is the correct thing, the most appropriate given their context? The business logic that we put into place for our own standards needs to be publicly accessible for an end user who may not be as savvy or understand exactly how we may produce data. That amount of complexity is really incumbent upon the Bureau to simplify. The thing that I like to point out is that there is a cottage industry of data repackagers for governmental data. They'll just make it easier to consume in one way or shape or form. And that's cool. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I do think that if that industry is born out of the government not making their data accessible, then we're missing the mark a little bit. And we need to do a better job of enabling the general consumption of data and then push the organizations to do more interesting things with the data, enrich it in other more interesting ways rather than it just being an access thing. And so, my mission really is to bring down that level of requirement on the users, regardless of their technical sophistication, to understand and use the data in whatever workflow makes sense.
Thanks, Zach. I'm going to actually go off script a little bit here and tug on that thread a little bit, because I know it sounds like obviously data as a product, data as a service is important for all the agencies and seems to be a major initiative, moving forward. But then there's always this kind of balancing act, I think, especially for federal agencies, right? And we hear it in the news with Facebook on kind of privacy and Apple and their differences and that sort of thing. Part of it is personalization, right? Everybody's kind of mentioned like, hey, it's difficult to make this data more accessible. And so you do have commercial organizations that basically will take all of your data, right? And your privacy and that sort of thing in order to deliver to you what you want. Whereas obviously federal agencies have, rules in place around privacy and that sort of thing. So how do you guys think, how does that play in your organization, and where do you kind of draw the line, or like, how do you manage that? Anybody can jump in on that one.
I'll quickly jump because privacy is one of the things that really excites me about what we do, because it is core to our values. It's one of the key distinctions I think we can claim in the market, where the data that is being provided to these federal agencies really it's incumbent upon us to protect your privacy, and that's a unique posture in a lot of these data-centric, social media platforms, where and oftentimes the data that's generated from your interaction with that site is the product itself. On the other hand, our mission is really to generate value from the data, but do it in a way that respects your privacy, and the really great work that we are doing in terms of the disclosure avoidance work that is kind of core and fundamental to this overhaul that the Bureau is doing, in terms of making sure that all of the different surveys and programs are consolidated under a singular disclosure avoidance process to not only protect the individual's right to privacy for that specific data product that we might be releasing, but also in concert with all the other data products, which, when you release data products from multiple angles, there's a potential for database reconstruction, which ultimately leads to identifiable information. And if we can, since we are taking this position of this holistic view of all the data that we are releasing, and again, with the sole focus on our privacy loss budgets to ensure that we are doing what is the most appropriate given the user's requirements for the data, but also for our users' privacy. It's a nice balance, and it's a differentiator in the market comparatively to like a Facebook, where and oftentimes that is what is being sold in certain cases, and that's I think that's a really interesting point that we can kind of lean into and say this is what makes us really important.
And I'll follow Zach up with, I think in data actually, Ken, that, and I echo what Zach said, I don't think that actually wavers. NASA would 100% uphold the privacy of the person who's accessing our data. I don't think that would ever waver. And I wouldn't ever expect it to either. But your question reminds me of something that my leadership has been discussing with our office. So my director, the division director of our group, because of what we manage. And we manage the other end of digital, which is in social media. And so she asked us all to watch the Netflix documentary, Social Dilemma. And afterwards, we had such a rich conversation about, are we contributing to, by NASA using very heavily, and NASA has a strong presence on social media, especially within the federal government, one of the strongest presences on social media. And so the question came up, are we contributing to this dilemma of what the social media private companies are in the midst of, the battle of selling people's privacy or granting access to privacy for others, et cetera. And I don't know the answer to that. And I also don't know how you manage it, but I can tell you that conversation has happened, that the thought leaders above us, above me, are telling us, pushing us to think about how, it's not realistic to stop communicating using the channels where people are, where people get their news, where people get their content, which is why we're on social media in the first place, because we're keeping with the times. But we do have to figure out, are we contributing to this clickbait kind of addiction to social media? So I thought your question was just interesting. We're in data. I don't think that's a problem at all. The scientific community is robust, and how we operate with our data is robust. But in the social media side, I think that is something we have to consider for the future.
Yeah, and Mamta, you touched on something which I think is like something that we think pretty heavily about, which is the cost of data. We're in this ecosystem now because as federal agencies, our rules are so stringent. What ends up happening is we hold all of this data, but then we also end up buying that same data back from the private industry because they've packaged it in a better way, in a more usable way than we have. So it's like we create the data, then we buy it back from someone who repackaged our own data, as opposed to just being able to discover it and use it. So that's one of the things that we've been thinking about, is reducing that cost, not only on ourselves as a federal agency, but as running the Medicare program, we also have providers as users, and how do you make sure that those providers are not being taken advantage of and having to also pay for that data that's been packaged in a much better way, in a more usable way. So again, going back to data as a product and making sure that we are managing privacy, but also keeping it free and accessible so that people can do the jobs that they need to do and rely on that data. And then back to Zach's point, then find ourselves in this bind of okay, but then how do you make sure that you're not being able to identify somebody with a rare disease, right? Because we deal with healthcare data, and it is very easy to work it back to, oh, this person in Texas has this disease, and that's that one person that's got it. Now I know who this person is because there was a study written about them. So we don't have a solution either, but one of the things we're really looking into is opting in versus opting out, and which one do you do by default in which use case. We've definitely landed on the fact that it is not a generic opt-in versus opt-out. It is a use case by use case thing. So and now that's what we're thinking about, is what does that framework look like?
All right, I'm going to move on a little bit. So I know, we'll get into successes. You all are trailblazers within your organization, driving culture change, evangelizing digital transformation. We also have a number of chief digital officers in our audience, not only for federal agencies, but also commercial organizations, associations. Can you let us know details about one or two success stories that you've had in your agency? Kind of what the secret to success, how did you make it happen, that sort of thing. Mamta, we'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. And Ken, I think you might even be able to add to this, because it was your team that really helped us lead the 2017 total solar eclipse, if you remember that. Yeah. So for those who may not remember, in 2017, we had an eclipse that cut across a large swath of the entire United States, the first time in almost a century that a total solar eclipse was visible to so many in our country. And so there were, almost nobody still living that had seen one before. And I remember, I would say the first thing in retrospect that led to, well, let me give you why it was successful, and then I'll take you back to why I think it became successful. It ended up being, at the time at least, I have not kept up with the Federal Digital Analytics Program to see if anything had beat it, but at the time, it was the single largest digital event that happened with the most traffic to a federal website, at least. And we had 90 million visitors on that single day, either watching the live stream of the eclipse through one of the telescope feeds that we had, or one of the balloons that was had a camera on board from student programs, or going to our eclipse site to learn more about how to safely watch it or enjoy it. But I think what made that successful is and that was 7 times more than the next biggest event that NASA had. So we were in uncharted territory. And I think that's what ended up leading to the success. And I was not the genius behind it. I implemented it, but it was my boss. I'll tell you off the bat, it was my boss, Kristen Erickson, who was kooky enough. I'm going to use that word because everyone who heard her say, you're going to prepare for the unprecedented and we're going to invest the money because we have it and we need to for the unprecedented. You can't even predict the traffic this is going to have. And every single person who heard me repeat her words, because that was the charge I was given, said, your boss is crazy. There's absolutely no way that this breaks records. No way that that many people are going to go watch an eclipse streamed live on a website at some government page. It's just not going to happen. But I think it was her vision and her insistence, not a single other person supported her, but it was her insistence that we were embarking on something that not most people in the entire country had not been able to see, and that there was going to be international interest in being able to see it if we were to actually invest in putting it up live streamed. So I think first it was just her vision and her not giving up on the vision, despite most people thinking that she was just off the wall. And then second, Ken, if you remember what we did, even though there are many times people said, are you sure you want to invest those taxpayer dollars? Because we don't think it's necessary, but we backed everything up. We had the CDN backed up. I mean, we had a plan A, plan B, and a plan C. And I almost had a plan D in case one of those others all failed. Like if they all failed simultaneously, we had servers backed up. I mean, every single thing had a backup. We even went to an unprecedented input from Amazon. The federal liaison from Amazon had said for the first time ever, Amazon put out a notice to their entire workforce that said nobody was to touch the servers on that day, just in case. It was, according to him, according to our federal liaison, that was unprecedented. And it just so happened, I think all of those steps in preparation, having the vision, insisting that we go forth, backing everything up, live streaming, and then having a backup to your live stream capability. We used Ustream because it was free, but because it was free, we also worried about whether or not it would be able to handle it. So we invested in another small business that also was able to live stream, had both of them there capable, just in case we had to swap over views. And the website never went down, which we were very, very happy about. And it was very nerve-wracking that day in the ops room. But it was also very exciting to see that we could cultivate excitement about an eclipse, you guys. It was just an eclipse, but people were so excited to learn about the sun. Why do we even care about it? That we could talk about planets and moons and all of these opportunities that came up to help increase scientific literacy of the masses of America, which I thought was probably the most exciting part of it. The numbers were great, but it's really what we got to talk about. So I'd say that's probably one of the most exciting digital successes we've had.
Yeah, that was pretty fun. I remember, I of course was stuck in the basement of headquarters watching servers. And you're right. I mean, Akamai actually had to reroute traffic because they were getting such volume or whatever. But that event, my wife and my kids went down to South Carolina. So watching the eclipse actually made her cry. So it was a huge event, I think, for everyone.
I love that story, Ken. Oh my gosh.
So, Zach, how about you?
Well, it's hard to follow that up.
Yeah,
I'd love to hear more about Akamai. Yeah, that alone, that story. I'd love to hear just like a day-to-day of how that went. You know, the war room would have been impressive. I would. You know, when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking, like, okay, so we had a really positive technical response to the 2020 census. I think the communications effort, we were working on a really uphill battle given the climate that we were in. I think that was one of those things that made me really proud to be a part of this organization in terms of the way in which the team, the whole organization responded to communicate the importance of that event, and the fact that our systems were able to withstand that impact. But I think the thing that I'd like to think about about this opportunity is more about the culture shift that we've seen in the building over the last few years. I think that has been really the most profound and important successes, at least from my perspective, because we've started to reverse the flow of the perception of a customer. For the longest time, we were in the business of collecting data and then tabulating it and reporting out. But it was a little bit more one stream in terms of directionality. We really were in the mindset of, let's collect the data, let's process it, let's make sure we get it to the stakeholders, the sponsor, whomever, and then we'll just begin the cycle all over again. What we've done in the last few years is really started to inculcate this idea that the dissemination really is where we want to start in terms of our thought. What is it we're trying to produce in terms of that product? What is its efficacy? How is it working? And how is the public or the consumer responding to that data? And then what can we do upstream at each step of the way to improve that product? And that goes to the tabulation product, that goes to the disclosure avoidance, that goes to the storage and maintenance and versioning of those data, then up even into the collection and the instrumentation. So how we collect the data and disseminating the data are now completely linked into this full circle, where the product is reinforming and reinforcing the user's belief that the value of giving us data is actually coming full circle and actually coming back to a tangible result. We still have a long way to go, and we're still in the early phases of this, but the cultural perception of the customer is downstream and not upstream. I'm not here to disseminate, ACS data or econ data. We're here to build a product that works for the public. What can ACS and econ do to help fix whatever gripes they might be having with it? And I think that flow reversal is like reversing a river. It's very hard. It's a lot of energy, but once you do get some momentum, it starts to build on itself. And I think, we're starting to reach that critical mass where everyone starts looking upstream, but what can I do to help and in response to the public? So I think that's the thing that I'm really, really psyched about.
Yeah, we always laugh that if it was just the tech, it would be easy, right? It's the culture and all the business processes.
Even 92 million per day. I don't know, that's pretty hard, but the culture, getting people to do things, that's a little harder sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Misu, how about you?
First of all, I think, Mampe, you have such a unique story on the day of the eclipse. I think we all remember it as a day in history, but your perspective is a very different story than anyone else's who saw the sky darken for a little bit. That's awesome. Yeah, one of our successes was actually similar to Zach's story of being able to go upstream in a raging river that's going downstream, which was the Blue Button Initiative, which I think some of you might be familiar with. And just to kind of time scale this to show the complexity of how difficult it is to go upstream. It's not the technology, again, that's the problem. The technology, we could open up an API and have all this claims data spill out of the agency. But the initiative started, I want to say at this point, probably about 4-ish years ago, where we said, oh, we have all Medicare claims data at this agency, right? Anytime you have visited a doctor and had a claim in Medicare, this agency holds it, right? So then why do we put the burden on both the doctors and the hospitals and the patients to run around with their CDs and binders and printouts and faxes across, there are so many users that we have now just burdened if we just put out this API. So a lot of that upstream was multi-layered, right? The first upstream was nope, that's way too scary. It's very it's extreme PII, right? It is all of your health information down to your social security number that is in the package of this API. So they were just nope, hard no from a privacy standpoint, from a legal standpoint. So that was the first hurdle that we had to overcome. And then the second hurdle was the the mental block of how do I develop an app that addresses all users, right? Like, how do you make it so it's easily understandable by someone who's 95, as well as someone who's 65, as well as a caregiver and a nurse, right? The complexity just kind of like paralyzed everyone. To which point we were able to just kind of pivot and say, hey, you don't have to design one mobile app that addresses all of this. You need to just release the data and then have the like market come to you and do what they will with the data, and then give people the freedom of choice to then go back to the market, right? It's like I can download something on Google Play, someone else can download something on an iPhone and have different experiences that fit our own individual needs, but the data and the information that we are getting back is the same. So like being able to backtrack all of that and land on our product as a federal agency is this API and the security around this API. And then what happens in the free market is like up to the free market and the consumer and the like providers. And what we have seen over the course of time now, over the last 4 years, is we now have an ecosystem of about 60 different application developers and like a multitude of use cases that we could have never planned for. You know, we have research companies that built an app that are doing aggregate data on like diabetes studies, right? Because now they have like nitty-gritty claims details, and the patients opt in that say, I want to improve my diabetes. I'm opting into giving you my data. And the patient is at the core of being able to say who gets their data and which apps they sign up for. And then we also have situations where you know, somebody like fainted at church, went unconscious, the ambulance showed up, and it was because of an adverse prescription like effect on their body, but their children in 2 different states on both coasts had access to the app and were able to go in and talk to the provider on the phone and say like, oh, mom's on all of these medications, right? Instead of the burden being like, hold on, I got to dig through these faxes, or I have to call this other doctor and get a list of the prescriptions. So like, all of these use cases are like not use cases that like the federal government could have built, and we kind of like it that way, right? Where we're like, here's all of the data, and like this way technology can keep up at the speed of technology, the government can continue at the pace of government, which I don't think they should be at the same pace, right? There is a reason that the government is slow, sometimes painfully, but I think like mostly rightfully slow, right? We don't want the government to move fast and break things, right? Like, we want the government to function regardless, right? And if they're functioning on a mainframe or they're functioning on the cloud, great, they're functioning. So I would say that's one of our biggest successes, is being able to unleash that data. And like where we've evolved that now is actually going a step further, not just unleashing the data, but actually being able to plug that into electronic medical records. So now your doctor doesn't have to download a separate app or have a separate portal. They can just plug in and get that data pushed to them. So if you are going from specialist to specialist, you as a doctor can go in and see your patient's data before they even come into your office. And that program is still in pilot phase. So we still have a ton of work to do there, but like, it's just been really cool to see over the past 4 years that evolution and like the increase in complexity and the use cases to hopefully one day, like what we try to do is also like the other layer that we've uncovered is the importance of user research, and not the user research of now, but the user research of like tomorrow. So starting younger, right? Like keeping on reminding people that like your Medicare population is getting younger. So don't just interview people who are 65 plus, start interviewing people who are 50 years, because again, at the speed of government, by the time you have that thing built, that 50-year-old is going to be on Medicare. So just, build an app that they're okay with using.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. I had never thought of it about that, but yeah, it's moving so quickly that you really want to be interviewing those folks. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the next one, which is kind of best practices, right? So for both agency staff and for government contractors, what would you say was the most important best practice to implement at your organization in order to enable kind of this successful digital transformation? Zach, do you want to start us off?
Well, yeah, I'm going to get on a soapbox here, but metadata to me is one of those things that we never invest in enough of. The maintenance of good metadata that can persist over time and allow for strong versioning of that metadata along with the underlying data is something that is, I think is, it's not in the disaster sense, but it's like, it's one of those things that you don't invest in enough in the early days because it's hard to convince people it's important. It's this dry thing, whatever. It doesn't have, there's something about it that it turns off long-term investment sometimes. And it's one of those things that I think ultimately can make or break a project. It's something that we always struggle with is trying to, like we were talking about discovery earlier. Metadata is truly the core center of that. And if you are good with your metadata, you treat your metadata as a first-class citizen next to the data, if not more important, then you will have so many more opportunities downstream to do more interesting things with that metadata. It can range as small as just having very strong controls in its version history to, taking it further afield and building crosswalks, not only to internal, third-party data providers who might have different, lexicons or vernaculars and ways in which you can create these crosswalks, but also allow for others to do more with your information. And so I've been railing about this, and it's probably more, best practices / failures. And so when we get to that question, I'm sure I'll bring this one up as well, because it's always something you can do more for, and so I think metadata to me is one of the most important things. And I'm also interested to know who that, I think we have a new guest panelist, Mamta, who's peeking over in the corner there.
Yeah, you should definitely not be surprised if I get 3 guest panelists. This one, you want to say hi? Wave. Hi. Yes.
Hey.
Yeah, I would not say my children are shy in any way, shape, or form.
Hi. In a weird sort of way, though, I feel like, in this new norm or whatever, it is actually somewhat humanizing, right? Because like office environments, while they're fun and all this kind of stuff, I've met so many pets and so many kids, I feel much more connected.
I'll follow up, Zach, and just saying the metadata makes me link it almost directly to what I had said before too. And I think probably the key best practice that we've been able to get our web teams to think about is SEO and following, when I remember we finally reached out to an expert company whose entire company and well-being was based on their expertise, which was in search engine optimization. And it was when we reached out to them and they told us, the old way of tagging like keywords, that's 2014. Like the way they, of course I'm saying it in Mamta speak, but they presented much more professional. But they said, that's 2014 and 2020, that's not how your search engines find your content. This is how they find your content. And when they laid it out is when the light bulb went off. And that's really how I got leadership above me to look at it. Because they thought us tagging and putting in keywords was still the way to do it. And it's not their job to keep up with those trends. But it was when I got that firmed up, actually got them to do a talk and a whole day seminar about this is how the search engines are finding our content, that we were able to get that buy-in. But it was really just looking at how we meta tag, looking at all of our metadata, how we organize it on the back end, and then how we actually provide it to the search engine. So I would link the two in that way. But I'd say that's probably the most critical best practice on the back end that we've been able to do. I hope, at least I think that. I'm sure there's many others I'm not thinking of, but.
Thanks, Mamta. Misu, how about you?
I think the thing that I'm about to say also piggybacks on what Zach and Mamta said too, which is the importance of developers as users as well. So like one thing that we've been able to do is convince leadership at CMS that human-centered design is important, and so being able to fold that into all the new contracts that we have worked on. Regardless of the contract. I think the way that we think about human-centered design is only when there is a front end. And what we've been able to convince leadership to do is say like, nope, I don't care how deep in the back end of this thing is, you need a designer, whether that's a researcher, somebody who's good at synthesis, or somebody who's like a service designer who can kind of map out the flow of data. Because what that forces you to then do is to talk to the engineers or the DBAs or what have you, to be able to put in the things like the metadata, the logging, the keywords, anything that impacts a business case that we don't ever think about until retroactively someone's like, hey, I wanted to know this piece of information. You're like, well, we never logged it. Sorry. Like, we never put in those keywords. We never tagged it, you know, and you just missed out on 5 years of data, as opposed to thinking proactively about the analytics or the monitoring and logging that should go into something. And we've found that the best practice way to do that is to start with a designer asking those right questions at the onset of developing a system. Whether that we're transforming a legacy system or building something greenfield, asking those questions and really driving the message of like, you know, your engineering team, they are also users, they are humans.
Yeah, can I just jump in, because that resonates so deeply with me when we're talking about like user experience and then we say like of the API and there's like a huge disconnect. It's yeah, and it doesn't even have to be for like public facing, like internal systems. The usability of internal functions can lead to the decrease of, you know, micro inefficiencies that just add up over time. And I just love that point. I really, yeah, I just like.
Yeah,
I'm going to piggyback off of that too, Ken. Sorry to interrupt you. But the user experience, how in the world could I have forgotten that? That's definitely getting our designers to think about the user first rather than themselves. And I know it's not exactly what you said, but piggybacking off of what you said, that's been a culture shift that we've had to make. Is you've got to think about what do they want to hear, not what does your boss want to do, but what does the user want to see? How do they consume your content? So I'd say that might be even a more important best practice that we've been able to, and it's been a slow shift. I wouldn't say everyone is on that yet, but we are shifting our web owners to start thinking from that perspective.
Yeah, it's always a balancing act between, you know, agency initiative and end user, right? As far as like, you know, what gets the headline on the websites or the mobile apps or whatever. But I like my team would love to hear like, hey, developers are users too. So let's move on to failures, right? So most of the, you know, folks on this webinar obviously drink the digital transformation Kool-Aid, but we know to achieve success, we often experience failures along the way. We like to shuffle them. But can you share with us the biggest failure that you've experienced and how you ultimately recovered and changed from that failure? Misu, I'll pick on you first.
Sure. Mine is actually the flip side of what I just shared as a best practice. We too were ignoring developers as users. So like our model at USDS, our way of working, and I'm sure a lot of you have picked up with like teams that have worked with us, is like we tend to go in like the show me, don't tell me about what you can do route. So we go into agencies and we'll build a prototype and we're like, look at this cool thing you can do. You too can have it. Here you go. Here's this project. So we went in and we did that. We were trying to convince CMS to move their legacy mainframe systems into the cloud. So we took a piece of the software module, wrote it up in Java and said, look, it can live in the cloud and your like, you know, maintainers can maintain this. And then their maintainers looked at it and said, no, we can't. You know, this is scary code, right? Because Java works and behaves and looks very different than COBOL does. And basically what we did is we translated a book for them and said, you understand this, right? And they were like, no, we don't. You know, like this is not a language that we know, like we have no training in this. And so that's kind of when the light bulb went off of, you know, developers are users and we didn't talk to them first before we went in and wrote this piece of code in a very object-oriented way where COBOL is very sequential, right? We told the story very differently than what they were used to in writing their code. So then we had to sit down with them and say, okay, tell us how your COBOL program works. We can write it in Java together in a very sequential way. It doesn't have to be as complicated and as modular Java enables us to get to. And that's kind of where the gear started shifting. We were able to pivot and say, like, it won't be the most optimal code, it won't be the most performant code, but it'll be functional code. And if this is what will convince you to down the road continue to use Java, that's a success for us. And that's when we started to put the like human-centered design requirements into contracts for helping that group maintain it, because we were like, this is a group of people that has been ignored. And then like the business keeps beating down on them saying like, well, why can't you change code? My policy changed. Why does it take you 8 months to change that code? And we're like, oh, this is where that inefficiency is happening. No one talked to the developers to say like, you need to change this because the policy goes into effect next week, you know?
Nice. Zach, I think you had a flip side argument as well.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's always a flip side of the metadata one. I was gonna go a slightly different route with and talk about kind of like the focus of tactics versus strategy. You know, when you're trying to make these big organizational changes, you'll have a strategy in place where you want to go, and you know, it'll be something that might, you know, be signed off on and everyone will be on board with it on paper. But oftentimes you resort to tactics, you know, like short-term kind of moves that might work you towards the destination, but won't necessarily be directly related to it. And, you know, I think that the idea that sometimes it's easy to fall prey to this tactic will work for the enterprise and moving us slightly over towards that strategy, but it's not directly in service to that strategy. And then you can get caught up in a lot of that small ball activities rather than making a more assertive claim like, we are going to do this and it's going to be painful. Let's go through that pain and trust that the enterprise who has bought in on the strategy is with you for that long term, instead of trying to make a small accommodation, short-term milestones that don't necessarily service that greater strategy as the long-term goal and focusing on that. So it's really just like being able to say no to those like quick wins that you might get points on the board, but ultimately aren't really the game that you're playing, which is again more to that cultural shift. But you know, I think just trust in the strategy, you know, and really lean into it, and people do buy into it. It's not just a paper exercise, and so just that organizational trust, I think, is really important.
And last but not least, Mamta.
Yeah, and I just looked at the time, so I'll try to keep it short, Ken. So you're able to get to some questions. Gosh, it's like, which failure do I want to pick? Is that sad? Let me see. I'd say this is less of, no, okay, so we don't have quite the solution. I'll tell you the proposed solution that we have said, but at key moments, we've had CMS failures on just certain websites, not all websites, because as I told you before, NASA has a plethora of public websites. But some of those are critical whenever we're making breaking news. And this was, I take us back to maybe 2015-ish. I can't remember the exact time frame, but prior to that, the only image we had of Pluto, the ones that we grew up with in textbooks, was a blurry image. We didn't really know what Pluto looked like, and it came from the Hubble Space Telescope. And we flew out back when Pluto was still a planet. We flew out.
You guys flew out into space.
He loves space. And he didn't quite hear that I was trying to make this fast. We flew out a spacecraft called New Horizons. It took a decade. Shine, let me get through this. It took a decade to get there, and when that first image was coming through, we knew that it would be a pretty high traffic spike. And when we tried to load the image, the CMS had failed. So the servers were fine, but the CMS failed. Our editors couldn't get in. And so what we're trying to do is propose in the new world of NASA Web, once we've modernized and transformed the digital space, how do we prevent that? Because it's not always predictable when your CMS fails. And when you've got everything consolidated into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 high-profile sites, you know, how do you prevent this? We've proposed having a second instance of the CMS, and I know that that's a huge cost burden because you won't always be using it. It's a backup plan, and you've heard my opinion on backup plans. But it's easy to justify a backup plan for a single event, but to have a backup plan for the continuation of all the days that you have a website is tough to justify from spending, being a good steward of the taxpayer dollar. So I don't know the solution to that. But I do know it's a problem. It's a big failure we've had in the past, and it's one that we have to be able to solve, especially as we go through this major digital transformation at NASA. That when we have those expected spikes, like a Mars landing, we have to be able to handle it, and we've got to get into the CMS. We can't have the unpredicted issues on the back end. So I'd say it's a process in work that we're still trying to find the appropriate solution. And I can only imagine, Ken, that your team will be part of that solution finding.
Okay. All right, we are out of time. I do want to throw one last question out. I apologize. I know that, well, we could talk obviously for a long time, but there was one from Kimberly Perlia. Sorry if I butchered your name. How can we reach out to the panel if we have solutions that meet some of these challenges or have questions about addressing other areas? So just a quick round and then we can wrap it up. Zach, do you want to start? Is there a way they can reach you or your agency?
Yeah, totally. I'll drop my email in the chat so folks can just reach out directly. I think that'll be probably easiest.
Nisu?
LinkedIn is probably the easiest for me.
And Mamta?
Yeah, if they go to the Contact Us page on science.nasa.gov, that comes directly to my team, and then they'll get it over to me.
All right. Unfortunately, I do want to be respectful. We're over time. This was a great discussion. Really enjoyed it. Thank you again, NVTC, Tom, and Harmonia Assad for helping us sponsor this event. Join AACC. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Ken.